Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? This is a line from a poem by world-renowned American poet Mary Oliver. Speaking of poetry and writing, my husband once asked me, if I were forced to choose between him and writing, which one would I choose? Before I got the chance to answer him, he told me he already knew what I was going to say. So of course, I didn't disappoint him. I told him I would choose writing over him. And that's when he asked for a divorce, and that was the end of that. I'm just kidding. What actually happened was that he looked at me and he smiled and nodded at my expected answer. And the point is that he understood that writing was something that I could not live without. That it was so a part of who I am and who I was, that not writing would be like I was consciously choosing to go against my nature. He also understood, and he told me this, that I was lucky to have found my calling. Most people didn't or don't. And they end up in situations or places where, for the most part, they had little to do with. It wasn't always the case, though. What I mean to say is that it wasn't always the case that I knew that I wanted to become a writer. It was not a realistic option while I was growing up. You see, other people did that. Other people published poetry and books. Other people wrote plays and acted in them and composed music and albums and fashion labels and art. Other people created things, platforms, initiatives, spaces. I was merely a passive recipient or a mediator of sorts. I was able to discover this passion, this calling, so to speak, as an adult, only in the past decade and a half, thanks to a series of experiences along the way. Experiences that, had I resisted, I would not be the person I am today. Experiences which I allowed to take me by the hand and lead me in the darkest of fog into another kind of future or three. What I had originally planned for my one wild and precious life was to become a high school English teacher, thanks to my undergrad degree in English literature as well as my teaching diploma for that exact purpose. This was my life plan, I thought at the time. A path my parents thought was good for me as a woman in general and as an Arab woman in particular. My mother, a biology teacher herself, thought that school teachers had the best vacation opportunities. You see, they took off during the school holidays and they had the whole summer to themselves to spend with their families as wives and mothers. Thank you, King Patriarchy, for the fixed and preconceived roles for each gender with a whole set of expectations. In other words, limitations. But not to get too detailed, I did teach as a high school English teacher for a while in Lebanon, but then life took me to other countries and other places. And the key thing is, in retrospect, is that I did not resist. For instance, life took me to the United States, where I lived in Iowa City for a while, and I still kind of held on to the belief that I would teach English at American schools. Never mind the irony that one of my friends joked and said, "Wait, you mean you, an Arab, are going to go and teach English to people whose first language is English?" Yeah. But it did not quite work out the way I had in mind, because I soon found out that there was a whole set of rules and regulations and coursework that I needed to consider in order to be certified as a teacher in the state in which I lived. And this was because I was foreign educated. So during the time that I was supposedly seeking to be certified as a teacher, I worked in various other fields. Jobs that I never considered with my degree, but I did them anyway. For instance, I folded clothes as a sales associate, and I practiced my smile, even and especially with despicable customers. Thanks to that job, I try not to be that despicable customer myself. I also had my bag investigated as a sales associate at the end of my shift, each time I checked out at the end of my shift. This was standard protocol, I was told, and I shouldn't have taken it personally. But I did. I couldn't help it. I couldn't help feeling hurt and offended by this so-called standard protocol. I folded bras and underwear at a famous American lingerie outlet. That lasted about 2 days before I said thanks, but no thanks. I also worked as a bookseller at a famous American bookstore, and I loved every minute of that. Being surrounded by people and books, and people who loved books and reading as much as I knew that I did. For some reason, no one investigated my bag at the end of that shift, because really, who would steal a book? Thought the consumerist capital of the world. But all the while, I wrote long emails back home to family and friends. Long, intricate, carefully constructed emails about my life in that Midwestern setting. I wrote about my longing for my homeland, and I wrote about my perception of the world around me as a woman, as a foreigner, and as a post-9/11 immigrant in the United States. And with time, people, my friends and my family, and friends of friends whom I'd never met, who had somehow received my emails, began to write back to me and tell me how much they enjoyed my stories and that they were looking forward to more. It became obvious that something was happening. People, other than my mother, actually wanted to read my crap. It also became obvious how much time and energy I was investing in composing these stories. And I began to realize that really, I wanted nothing more but to spend the rest of my time doing just that, to write. This was a scary thought, because this was not part of the original plan of becoming a high school teacher. So I took that scary thought and I went with it, and I applied for a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing at one of the top schools in the city. When I asked about the application process, I was told that I needed to be published first. That's when it struck me. Me, published, as in I do the work and someone likes it enough to make it public on beautifully bound sheets of paper. To me, it felt impossible. But I kept at it. I kept at the writing, and sometime later, and various jobs and years later, I reapplied for an MFA in creative writing, and I got accepted into the University of Missouri, St. Louis. That's when a whole new world opened up around me. My being the only Arab in the English department was irrelevant. I was surrounded by people who loved and appreciated words and language and writing as much as I did. And it was a natural expectation to produce work that had the potential of being published. During that time, I also got introduced to poetry journals and magazines and poetry and literary readings, where people would stand up in front of an audience and they would share their art, they would share their work, and no one in the room thought this was a complete waste of everyone's time. I felt at home. Not only was it not a complete waste of everyone's time, but people, including myself, felt something there. Words mattered. Words could change people, perceptions, life paths. It was a powerful tool. I knew how much it had changed me as a lover of books and readings, but I never thought that one day I would possibly become a producer or a creator of books and reading myself. With time, I began sending my work out to be published in various literary magazines. And I got a zillion rejection letters before I even got a glimpse of publication. So during my time in the US, I was not only a potential thief, remember the sales associate protocol, I was also someone whose voice would easily be dismissed or muffled, intentionally or non-intentionally. And I don't mean my literal voice, I mean my voice of being. You see, not many people whom I met at work or at school really knew where Lebanon was on the map. And very few people seemed to care where I was really from. And then later on, when I got naturalized as an American citizen, I was actually told on more than one occasion to no longer say that I was Lebanese. I was expected to become fully American. It did not sit well with me. Now, maybe I'm a difficult person, but I felt boxed in and trivialized into an identity so immediately without warning or clarification. So I decided to take my voice back, even in the smallest of ways. So for instance, during my master's program, my writing did not include characters whose names were Jack and Jennifer and Donald. Definitely not Donald. They included common Arabic names like Layla and Selma and Ziyad. They included flavors from my kitchen, the weather in Beirut, street names and jargon from my ancestors. In other words, they included things that I cared about, politically and socially and intimately. And ironically, the more I did this, the more I felt like I belonged. And St. Louis began to feel like a second home to me. During my newly discovered life in the US, I felt that something was missing. I felt that something related to my identity as an Arab Anglophone writer was dismissed. Most of the magazines and journals that I had become familiar with and had published in were produced by older white men, or white men in general, or white women, or people of color, but who were mostly produced in the West. Nothing that represented me as an Arab Anglophone writer was produced in the Arab region by an Arab person. So one morning, over coffee and a cigarette, I decided, you know what? Why don't I do this myself? Why don't I start something that I feel would fill a gap in the Anglophone literary narrative? This idea was born a while before I actually made it happen, as is the natural case with a lot of ideas that we come up with. Fear has a lot to do with that delay. But finally, when I moved back closer to the region, I finally made it happen thanks to several things, thanks to technology and thanks to WordPress and a little bit of perseverance and common sense and a whole lot of negative opinions which I chose to ignore. I founded Sukoon magazine, an Arab-themed literary magazine that publishes art and literature in English. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for all the positive feedback that I got since then from writers and from readers for starting this platform, for filling up a much-needed gap, for shedding light on marginalized voices in a scarred and underrepresented region. The reward for this is priceless. I also want to say that when I began participating in the poetry and literary events back in St. Louis, I began to have people talk to me about my work, which represented all that I knew from my life, from my home, from my angst from a distance, or my wars. And these people would come up and talk to me and tell me how much it kind of made them think about their world, maybe their privileges, maybe their distance, their somewhat partial lens. Two new things, two unexpected things happened to me while I was in Dubai as well, after Sukoon. I got my nonfiction collection published by a publisher, and my poetry manuscript was also picked up by another publisher and turned into a poetry chapbook. Whole books, my words, out there in the universe. I felt nauseous and incredible all at once. In a nutshell, I just want to say that basically I moved from my plan of becoming a high school teacher to my discovery of becoming a poet, a creative writer, a creative copywriter, an editor of a literary magazine, an organizer of literary events, as well as a university instructor. I have learned so much from each and every step of the way, from each and every turn of events that came my way. I don't think we realize how important it is to always keep our minds and eyes open to what might come our way unexpectedly. We won't know what we're truly capable of or what we truly care about if we don't allow ourselves to let go of rigid belief systems about ourselves first. Belief systems which we inherit with or without our permission. Even this teaching opportunity here at Phoenicia University, which I love and appreciate, came unplanned. Coincidentally, around the same time that I was moving back to Lebanon after being away for so many years. When the opportunity came up, I went with it. And I honor this path, trusting that only positive things will come out of it. So I urge you, I urge us, to stop staring at our phones all day, as we tend to do these days, to stop hiding behind our technology, but instead create our own progress. I urge you to go out there and do things and make mistakes and get angry and get over yourself and move forward. Discover who you are, and if you don't like that person, it's fine. Explore something else. There's a whole world out there up for the taking. And finally, if I were to take the obnoxious liberty for the purpose of this talk of modifying Mary Oliver's perfect line, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and perfect life? I would say instead, tell me, what is it you plan to undo, unfold, discover, explore with your one wild and precious life? Thank you.